I'm going to talk today about Canadian culture, novel writing, movie making, and how we can sort of bring these things together in a way that hopefully will lead to more success in terms of Canadian culture reaching more people, especially within Canada, but also without. And I'd like to frame the discussion as I sort of go along. I'm going to make a series about this. It's not just going to be this thing that I'm doing right now as a standalone project that will describe these ideas, but I would like to make sort of a series dealing with this and talking with various Canadians, various Quebecois, various First Nations who are producing work that they would like to reach a larger audience. Donc, je vais parler avec des francophones, des autochtones et des autres que les anglophones seulement qui produisent les cultures narratives, les cultures dramatiques. Okay, now let me just open by sort of setting some parameters for what I'm going to talk about. And the first is that point number one that I'd like to sort of describe as a parameter is that cultural forms that tell stories can be grouped together into a general category of narrative fictions that includes novels, dramatic films, long and short stories, and some poems. 2. Narrative fictions are an essential component of a sense of national self, however one defines national. 3. Canadian narrative culture is failing to successfully dominate within its own territory. Put differently, we don't have enough narrative fictions that reach and resonate with a sufficient percentage of Canadians to have what might be termed a healthy national culture. 4. Lack of attention by Anglophones to other language cultures within the national borders of Canada, French, First Nations, exacerbates this weakness. 5. We are not wealthy enough to produce a quote-unquote big budget culture, so we have to think of new yet economical ways to reach a larger audience. Now, to open, I'd like to quote extensively from an interesting essay that was written by the author, critic, and cultural nationalist Rick Salutin. It's an article on Canadian culture within the context of globalization. And Salutin begins. Let me begin by explaining what I mean when I use the term globalization and what I do not mean. I do not mean globalization in the sense of the communications revolution, the information highway, the internet, and other breathless coinages. Every advance in communications technology over the past 200 years has been hailed as unprecedented, transformative, inaugurating a new version of human nature, extending democracy, and so forth, etc., etc., etc. The sense in which I do mean to use globalization refers to the global economic reach and power of corporate capital in our time. In its case, I would also like to enter a routine demur against the claim that it truly counts as globalization in some general and unique sense. It is certainly not the only form of globalization or even the only form of economic globalization which could be imagined or achieved. It is capitalist and corporate. It subjugates all human values and social possibilities to economic calculation and the profit advantage of a few huge players, and they are growing ever fewer, etc. Globalization in this sense is a terribly serious threat to the cohesion of societies and the welfare of individuals, one which seems to me comparable to the situation in Europe before the First World War. A savage, destructive global conflict is having massive deleterious effects, and so far we have only seen their beginnings. He continues, Salutin continues, one of the most striking phenomena of our times is the increased importance of national cultures in this era of globalization. Given the great disruptions that globalization has occasioned in people's lives everywhere, it is predictable that they should turn to traditional sources of stability and identification. Whatever provides such a resource will be valued, clung to, and, if necessary, resuscitated. We see this in the renewed attachment to religion in our time, from Islamic fundamentalism to the born-again Christians of the United States and Latin America. And then Salutin goes on to focus specifically on Canada. Our own Canadian culture is particularly threatened in the present age of globalization. The very nature of national culture in Canada, especially in English-speaking Canada, and the special role of institutions in that culture make it vulnerable. I refer both to institutions that are specifically cultural, like the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and institutions that are non-cultural, like the healthcare system. As well, some institutions are both cultural and non-cultural. Most other countries have expressed their nationhood in more elaborate, sometimes even murky or mystical ways. You could say that we lack the kind of glue which has characterized most national societies and held them together. Glue such as a distinct national language, a long history, a deeply embedded culture or folklore, and a national mythology, the quote-unquote American dream, 19th century England's white man's burden, the French mission civilisatrice. Nations can survive political or economic dislocations when they possess that kind of glue. Harold Innis once pointed out that France puts on and takes off constitutions without the French ever wondering whether the La France will cease to be. It is unthinkable. The French nation's language and culture guarantee its survival. Poland didn't exist on a map for 125 years, but its reality for the Polish people remains strong. It is true that we Canadians, I should repeat here that I'm speaking mainly of Canada outside Quebec, have a few symbols. A beaver, a cop on a horse, a game played on ice. But we lack a language that's uniquely our own, a long history, folklore or myths, even a cuisine, which should not be underestimated as a source of national sense of self. I'd say the one thing we've counted on in place of all these is a set of socially constructed institutions, the railroad, the CBC, our network of social programs, maybe the post office. These are real, not mythical entities, but they serve a reassuring function like myths and other glues. They not only deliver actual things like TV shows, pension checks, or mail, they give us a sense of cohesive society. Now, that article, and I've made, I've chopped it up. I've made several jumps from paragraph to paragraph, just to sort of summarize the sense of it. That article was published in 1999. It's approximately 23 years old. So that gives you a sense of what the situation was then and what the situation is now. And I would argue that the situation now is not really that different. It's certainly not very much improved. And now what I'd like to do next is go down to an interview that I did a few years ago in November 2018. So this is a little over 3 years ago with Russell Smith. And in that interview, that discussion, which we did partly by phone and partly by email, I wanted to sort of zero in on this question of why Canadian novels don't sell particularly well. And I asked Smith, in a piece of yours published on July the 3rd, 2015, you argued against Brad Martin's stated goal of only publishing books that would make at least $100,000, approximate sales of 8,000 by your calculation. Brad Martin is, I think he still is, the CEO of Penguin Random House in Canada, one of the big multinationals that also publishes Canadian authored books. Yet these are not big figures for American bestsellers. 8,000 is not a big deal in the US. In our conversation, you mentioned Madeleine Teen's morally serious, self-consciously literary novels as big bestsellers in Canada. The US gleefully publishes the very awful, very popular writing of Stephanie Meyer, James Patterson et al. Do we have a rather pretentious idea of what bestsellers should be? Are we in some ways victims of our own self-imposed limitations? And Smith answered, this is a good question. You point to an important difference between US and Canadian culture. We tend not to produce successful commercial genre fiction. Our commercial hits are the Madeleine Taines, the good-for-you, big-issue literary books. In a sense, this is also a genre with its own formulae. I think you could easily get a computer program to crank out a few Amy McKay novels. Now, again, this exchange with Smith took place a little over 3 years ago. Just today, this morning, I had an exchange with another author, John McFetridge, about the state of Canadian fiction. Now, McFetridge is a mystery writer. He's a genre writer. And he's worked in TV, film, and novel writing. His point was that that the situation remains grim. And I've had several conversations online with McFetridge about the state of Canadian fiction publishing, the state of Canadian TV, the state of Canadian movie making, and so forth. And his point has often been, first of all, that there is not very much money that gets poured into Canadian TV and film, and that is detrimental to its success. With publishing, he has made the argument that it's sort of a multifactorial situation in which publishers, Canadian-owned publishers, do try to market their books as best they can. Again, they don't have big budgets to do that. But in bookstores, there's a lot of competition, effectively, in a bookstore. If you walk into a big box bookstore like Indigo or something like that, you will find that Canadian authored books only constitute a small percentage of the total books on the shelves. If you shop online at Amazon, for example, you'll find that the Canadian content is drowned out even more. Now, I think that this question is very hard to resolve because there is not the political will, effectively, to regulate the percentage of Canadian books that are on Canadian shelves, just as there is not the political will to regulate very seriously the amount of Canadian movies that are in Canadian movie theaters. Canadian movie theaters have been ignored recently because of the coronavirus and shutdowns, lockdowns. But even on Canadian TV, there is not much of a strong, powerful formula to make sure that Canadian content dominates. McFetridge once commented wryly that with the private broadcasters in Canada, such as Global, CTV, they are obliged by CRTC regulations to produce a certain amount of Canadian content. They have X percentage of Canadian programming that they have to produce. And their attitude has always been, quote unquote, not a moment more, not a second more. They will produce what they're obliged to do, and that's it. With the CBC, which does have sort of a mandate, not sort of, but does have a mandate to produce specifically Canadian culture, the percentages are greater, but again, there's this trouble reaching audiences. The CBC's audience among Canadians is only something like 2% of all the TV viewed. With book publishing, the situation is somewhat better. A report was done a few years ago by an association of Canadian book publishers called the More Canada Report, and it pointed out that the percentage of books and magazines published in Canada by Canadians has traditionally been around 25% of total sales of books and magazines within Canada. And that percentage recently, in recent years, has dropped by around 50% to around 12.5%. The publisher Bev Dorio the publisher writer Bev Dorio commented quite some time ago in an interview that I did with her in the aughts that part of the problem is our borders are too open. We don't impose percentages. We don't impose percentages of bookshelf space, percentages of screen time, percentages of TV time on Canadian modes of distribution. And the author-critic Brian Fawcett has made a very similar point. When I had a discussion with Fawcett and remarked that really, when one compares the situation in South Korea, where I've lived for a long time, with the situation in Canada, the Koreans, for many, many years, were much more aggressive about making sure that there was a sufficient screen quota in Korean theaters so that Korean movies and their movie industry would have an opportunity to really thrive. Those screen quotas exist on paper in Canada. We have a NAFTA agreement with the United States, which makes allowance for Canadian governments to treat culture as a sort of unique form of economic production. And despite the existence of free trade between Canada and the United States, Canadian governments theoretically, on paper, have the right to dictate, to legislate that more shelf space in stores, more time on TV or in theaters or on streaming sites be devoted to Canadian content, but Canadian governments have tended to shy away from doing that, probably because of the power of the influence of lobbyists. In any case, the situation is not very good in Canada, no matter how you look at it. And to return to sort of the economic factors that help inhibit the production of a successful narrative fiction culture in Canada, we get back to the issue of money that's available. Most of the money for film production comes through, in Canada, comes through government agencies, Telefilm. Most of the money that Canadian publishers rely on, obviously they rely on their sales too, but their most solid, steady form of income, again, is grant support and forms of incentivization. In other words, not only do publishers in Canada get block grants, but they get sort of smaller grants to publish with Canadian printing houses, to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so in this situation, because the Canadian government is only, and provincial governments are only willing to spend so much on culture, you end up with this situation in which culture exists within Canada, but it always seems to be sort of clinging to the edge of a cliff. It never really sort of thrives, and it never really dominates within its own territory. And as I also said at the beginning of this piece, because there is simply not enough translation between English and French, a lot of the great work that gets produced by Francophones or by First Nations working in their own languages doesn't get transferred over to this English-speaking audience in Canada. It's a very sort of messed up situation, and it never really seems to change. You know, recall that Salutin piece was published in 1999. It could have been published in 1989. It could have been published in 2008. It could have been published in 2019. It will probably be publishable in 2029. The situation just sort of is in a holding pattern. It's sort of stuck. Now, what can we do about this? That is the next question. And I think that, first of all, we need to start thinking about narrative fiction in terms of its totality. We have to think of books and movies and TV shows and even some poetry as sort of a collective, interconnected category. More on this topic to follow.